The office door closes with a soft click. Los Angeles, 1948. Late afternoon light leaks through the slats of Venetian blinds on the top floor of the MGM administration building in Culver City. Dust floats in the beam, suspended, unmoving. The air smells faintly of cigars and furniture polish. Eddie Mannix is already seated. Louis B. Mayer stands near the window, hands behind his back, staring down at the studio lot. And across from Mannix, perched on the edge of a leather chair as if she owns the room, sits Hedda Hopper, hat still on, gloves folded neatly in her lap. The joke has just been made. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even clever. Careful, someone had said with a small, careless laugh. Too many loose mouths around here. It hangs in the air. No one smiles now. Mannix does not respond. He doesn't correct it, he doesn't defend anyone, he doesn't even look offended. He simply lowers his eyes and reaches for the telephone. The rotary dial makes a soft ticking sound as he turns it, once, twice, 3 times. The room becomes very still. Hedda Hopper watches him closely. Mayer shifts his weight but says nothing. He knows that sound. Everyone in this room knows that sound. The call isn't loud. Mannix speaks quietly, calmly. Hello, yes, I need you to make a few calls tonight. A pause. At home. He hangs up gently, no slamming, no raised voices, just the soft placement of the receiver back into its cradle. That's it. No explanation, no argument, no threat. But something irreversible has just been set in motion. Outside the office, down the corridor lined with framed film posters and portraits of contract stars, a young actress waits on a stiff-backed chair. She smooths the skirt of her dress over her knees, unaware that her future is being reorganized in that room. She thinks she's here to discuss publicity. Inside, no one explains what the calls are about. No one needs to. In 1948 Hollywood, Eddie Mannix doesn't yell. He arranges. And when he makes a call to someone's home, it isn't about business. It's about containment. By 1948, Eddie Mannix was more than a studio executive. Officially, he was MGM's general manager. Unofficially, he was the man who handled what could not be handled in public. Scandals, arrests, affairs, deaths. If a star crashed a car at 3 in the morning, Mannix arrived before the police report was finalized. If a contract player was caught somewhere he shouldn't be, the story changed before sunrise. If a headline threatened the studio's carefully polished image, Mannix adjusted reality. He did it quietly. He did it efficiently. And most importantly, he did it without leaving fingerprints. That afternoon in 1948, the issue wasn't murder or drugs or a courtroom. It was something smaller. Reputation. A rumor had started circulating about one of MGM's young actresses. Not a household name, not yet, but promising, fresh, carefully packaged by the studio as wholesome and obedient. The kind of star MGM specialized in manufacturing. The rumor wasn't explosive, it wasn't criminal, it was personal, and it was beginning to drift toward Hedda Hopper's column. And once it reached print, it would never be retrieved. Hopper had built a career on knowing everything first. Her column could make or break contracts. She dressed flamboyantly, wrote viciously, and maintained friendships with studio heads while threatening them daily. She didn't bluff. She didn't need to. So when someone in that office made a light comment about loose mouths, it wasn't just a joke. It was a warning. And warnings in Hollywood rarely stayed jokes. Mayer finally turns from the window. You're overreacting, he says softly. It's not a challenge, it's almost a plea. Mannix looks up. Am I? There's no anger in his voice, just calculation. Hopper tilts her head slightly, watching, measuring. The power in this room isn't loud, it's layered. Mayer owns the studio, Hopper controls public opinion, Mannix controls consequences. And the actress outside controls nothing. Mannix leans back in his chair. Loose mouths, he repeats quietly. The phrase is no longer humorous. Because in Hollywood, loose mouths don't just talk. They cost money. They damage stock prices. They invite federal scrutiny. They shift leverage. And most dangerously, they weaken authority. Mannix understands something others don't. Rumors aren't dangerous because they're true. They're dangerous because they spread. And once they spread, control disappears. He doesn't ask Hopper if she plans to print the story, that would give her power. He doesn't accuse anyone of leaking information, that would cause panic. He simply makes calls. To agents, to husbands, to brothers, to quiet men who prefer to settle things in kitchens instead of offices. At home, where reputations feel more fragile. Where fear feels more intimate. Down the hall, the young actress hears a door open. Her name is called. She rises, smoothing her hair, stepping into the office with a practiced smile. She sees Mayer first, he gives her a warm, paternal nod. She sees Hopper, the columnist's eyes scan her quickly, clinically. And then she sees Mannix. He smiles. It's not friendly, not unkind either. Just neutral. Have a seat, he says. She does. The blinds cast striped shadows across the carpet, across her hands folded tightly in her lap. No one mentions the rumor. No one mentions the joke. Mannix asks her about her family, where they live, how often she visits, whether her mother still answers the home phone. It feels conversational. Casual. But something in the room feels slightly tilted. Hopper watches her reactions, Mayer watches Mannix. And Mannix watches everything. The actress laughs once lightly when Hopper makes a remark about Hollywood stories. No one else laughs. The silence stretches a second too long. That's when she realizes. This is not a publicity meeting. This is an evaluation. Of loyalty. Of discretion. Of usefulness. Mannix finally leans forward, elbows on the desk. There are many ways to have a career here, he says gently, some last longer than others. He doesn't elaborate. He doesn't need to. She nods. The meeting ends 10 minutes later. She leaves with a new contract amendment waiting to be drafted. Hopper leaves with nothing written in her notebook. Mayer returns to the window. And Mannix reaches for the phone again. Because the first round of calls was only preparation. The second round will make sure no one jokes again. What happened that night was never printed. No headlines. No retractions. No scandal. But 3 households in Los Angeles received phone calls after dinner. And in each of those houses, a private conversation shifted something permanently. By morning, the rumor had stopped moving. Not corrected. Not denied. Just contained. But here what makes the moment dangerous. It wasn't about protecting a star. It was about reinforcing a system. A system where silence could be arranged. Where careers depended not on talent alone, but on obedience. And where a man who smiled and said nothing could change the trajectory of someone's life with a single quiet call. The joke in that office never resurfaced. No one repeated it. Because they all understood something after that afternoon. In MGM, power did not shout. It dialed. And once it dialed your home, it never needed to explain why. The calls didn't come immediately. That was intentional. Eddie Mannix understood timing the way directors understood lighting, too fast and it looked reactive, too slow and it looked weak. He waited until dinner plates were cleared across Los Angeles. Until husbands loosened their ties. Until wives stepped into kitchens. Until agents believed the day was finished. Then he began. The first call went to an agent who represented 2 MGM contract players and 1 rising ingenue at a rival studio. The man answered on the second ring. He knew who it was before Mannix spoke. People always knew. Evening, Mannix said calmly. No pleasantries. No explanation. Just a measured pause. I've been told there's confusion about one of our girls. The word confusion carried weight. It suggested carelessness, disloyalty, lack of control. On the other end, the agent swallowed audibly. I don't know what you're referring to, Eddie. Another pause. I think you do. Silence. The kind that makes a man picture his client's contracts laid out on a desk somewhere far away from him. Mannix didn't threaten him. He didn't mention canceling deals or freezing casting opportunities. He simply said, I'd hate for confusion to spread. It can make people unreliable. Unreliable was worse than scandalous in 1948 Hollywood. Scandal could be managed. Unreliability meant you were no longer useful. The call lasted 3 minutes. By the time it ended, the agent had already decided to discipline the assistant who had been repeating rumors at a cocktail party in Beverly Hills 2 nights earlier. Not because Mannix ordered it, but because Mannix didn't need to. The second call went to a home in Pasadena. A brother, not involved in the industry, not under contract, which made him harder to control. When he answered, Mannix introduced himself without warmth. "I represent your sister's employer." A long pause followed. "I understand she's been under stress, new town, new friends." The implication hung there. The brother bristled slightly, protective. "She's fine." "I'm glad," Mannix replied, "because the town can be unforgiving to those who misunderstand how things work." He let that sit. He didn't accuse her of speaking out of turn, he didn't mention the columnist, he didn't explain the consequences. He simply reminded the brother that Hollywood was not like other places. And that proximity to fame did not equal power. When the call ended, the brother phoned his sister. His voice was different. Lower. Urgent. "Who have you been talking to?" The actress felt her throat tighten. The meeting that afternoon came rushing back to her, the striped light on the carpet, Mannix's neutral smile. She denied everything. But the doubt had already entered the room. And doubt is powerful. It makes people cautious. It makes them smaller. The third call was the quietest. It went to a house in Brentwood. Hedda Hopper answered it herself. She recognized Mannix's voice instantly. "You're busy tonight," she said coolly. "I am," he replied. "A bit. I thought you might appreciate clarity." Hopper didn't respond immediately. She had built her empire on information, on access, on making powerful men uneasy. Very few called her at home to suggest clarity. "Go on," she said. Mannix spoke slowly. "There are stories that benefit everyone, and stories that benefit no one." Hopper smiled slightly, though he couldn't see it. "You think this one benefits no one?" "I think it complicates relationships that have been very productive." That word, productive, meaning cooperative, profitable, mutually advantageous. He wasn't asking her to bury a story. He was reminding her of the ecosystem. Columns required studio access. Studio access required goodwill. Goodwill required discretion. Hopper leaned back in her chair, the telephone cord stretched taut between her fingers. "You're suggesting restraint. I'm suggesting perspective." They ended the call without agreement. But the next morning, her column mentioned a different actress entirely. The rumor evaporated. Inside MGM, the shift was subtle but immediate. Assistants stopped repeating whispers in hallways. Secretaries became more careful about which lines they left connected. Publicists began asking one another who said that, before asking, "Is it true?" Mannix didn't issue a memo. He didn't reprimand anyone publicly. He simply allowed the memory of that afternoon to circulate. The joke, the silence, the dialing, and the calls at home. Fear doesn't require spectacle. It requires demonstration. And demonstration had been delivered. For the young actress, the consequences were less visible but more personal. 2 days after the meeting, she was handed a revised morality clause. Standard, she was told. Routine. It expanded the studio's authority to suspend her without pay for conduct deemed damaging. She read it carefully. The language was broad. Ambiguous. Deliberate. She signed. What choice did she have? Her salary supported her family back east. Her name was just beginning to appear in theater marquees. Her photograph was still being tested for magazine covers. She told herself it was precautionary. That everyone signed these things. But she also stopped attending certain parties. Stopped confiding in certain friends. Stopped laughing too loudly when someone mocked the studio system. She began watching herself the way Hopper had watched her in that office. Evaluating. Measuring. Correcting. Mannix had not punished her. He had reshaped her. Louis B. Mayer noticed the shift. He saw how quickly the tension dissolved once the calls were made. He saw how smoothly production continued. He saw how Hopper's column remained cooperative. And he understood something about Mannix that had always unsettled him. Mayer believed in control through paternal authority, through emotional loyalty, through the idea that stars were family. Mannix believed in control through consequence. The difference was quiet, but it was absolute. Mayer could inspire devotion. Mannix inspired caution. And caution lasted longer. What makes this moment dangerous is what happened publicly. It's what didn't. No screaming match. No scandalous headline. No dramatic firing. Just a recalibration of behavior across multiple households in one evening. Hollywood in 1948 was built on illusion. But behind the illusion was a network of leverage. Studios held contracts that bound actors for 7 years. Morality clauses dictated private conduct. Publicists fed stories to friendly columnists. And fixers like Mannix ensured that when something threatened the system, it was handled quietly. This wasn't organized crime. It didn't need to be. The power was institutional. And institutions don't need to threaten loudly. They just need to remind you who answers the phone when it rings at night. The actress began noticing small changes. A role she expected to test for went to someone else. A lunch invitation from a co-star was withdrawn. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. But the edges of her world felt tighter. As if invisible boundaries had been drawn. She started arriving early to set. Staying late. Volunteering for publicity appearances. Smiling more carefully. Because somewhere in the back of her mind was the image of Mannix's hand turning the rotary dial. She never heard the calls. But she felt them. Weeks later, at another gathering inside MGM, someone began to joke again. Not about loose mouths. About box office numbers. It was harmless. Laughter rippled. Then it faltered. Just slightly. Because Mannix was standing near the doorway. Not speaking. Not reacting. Just listening. The room recalibrated instantly. Voices lowered. Topics shifted. No one wanted to hear a phone dial again. And that was the point. Power that announces itself must be repeated. Power that whispers only needs to be demonstrated once. But here's the part no one in that office understood yet. The calls had done more than silence a rumor. They had drawn a line. And lines once drawn tend to be crossed eventually. Because fear controls behavior. But it also breeds resentment. And resentment in Hollywood has a way of surfacing years later. Quietly. In memoirs. In testimony. In stories that were once too dangerous to tell. At the time, though, none of that seemed possible. The system was intact. The rumor was gone. Hopper's column remained friendly. The actress continued working. And Eddie Mannix returned to his desk the next morning as if nothing had happened. But something had. Because the people who received those calls would never forget the sound of his voice in their kitchens. And neither would she. It didn't explode. There was no reckoning in 1948. No public confrontation, no whistleblower, no scandal that cracked the marble floors of MGM's executive wing. The system worked. That was the unsettling part. The actress's next film opened modestly. Her name appeared in clean type on theater posters. Hedda Hopper mentioned her once briefly in a favorable aside about fresh faces with proper studio guidance. Proper. The word carried weight. It meant managed. It meant corrected. It meant safe. From the outside, nothing looked different. MGM remained the most powerful studio in Hollywood. Louis B. Mayer continued hosting lavish parties. Stars still smiled for photographers under hot white lights. And Eddie Mannix continued walking the lot with the same calm, unhurried pace. But inside smaller rooms, something had shifted permanently. The brother in Pasadena never forgot that call. He never heard an explicit threat. No demand, no contracts cited. Just tone. Just implication. Just the quiet reminder that his sister's career rested in hands he would never meet. When she phoned him weeks later, her voice sounded different. Measured. Guarded. I'm fine, she told him. But he could hear calculation where excitement used to be. She stopped telling him about studio gatherings, stopped repeating jokes from sets, stopped speculating about executives. Not because she'd been ordered to. Because she'd understood. That realization was the real consequence of that afternoon. Not punishment. Self-policing. And self-policing lasts longer than fear. Inside MGM, Eddie Mannix's reputation solidified further. He was already known as the man who could fix problems. By the late 1940s, his responsibilities had expanded beyond scandal management. He monitored budgets, oversaw productions, managed contracts. But everyone understood his other role. If something threatened the illusion of control, it passed through him. There are moments in institutions when power becomes visible. Not in a speech, not in a decree, but in a reaction. The joke in that office had revealed something fragile, that information could slip sideways, that someone might laugh at the machinery instead of respecting it. Mannix didn't correct the joke verbally. He corrected the atmosphere. After those calls, the laughter in executive meetings changed. It grew shorter, safer, more rehearsed. Assistants began editing themselves before speaking. Publicists stopped testing boundaries. The ecosystem tightened. And that tightening was efficient. Years later, some of the people involved would describe Hollywood in that era as protective, disciplined, structured. They rarely used the word afraid. But fear doesn't always look like trembling hands. Sometimes it looks like composure. The actress built a career that lasted through the early 1950s. She never became a superstar, but she remained employed. Dependable. Professional. Quiet. In interviews decades later, when asked about the studio system, she would smile faintly and say, they knew how to take care of their own. She never mentioned the meeting. Never mentioned the calls. Because to mention them would require admitting how much power had been exercised without being seen. And that kind of admission carries its own risk. Hedda Hopper continued writing. Her columns remained sharp, strategic, sometimes brutal. But she understood the boundaries. The 1948 incident had not humiliated her. It had reminded her. Columns depended on access depended on cooperation depended on mutual restraint. She never publicly acknowledged Mannix's influence. She didn't need to. The absence of certain stories was acknowledgement enough. In Hollywood, what isn't printed can be louder than what is. Louis B. Mayer would eventually lose control of MGM in 1951, pushed out during corporate restructuring. The old guard began to fracture under new financial pressures. Television was rising, audiences were changing. The studio system itself would weaken under antitrust rulings and shifting economics. But in 1948, none of that was visible from that office. What was visible was order. And order had been restored by a man who smiled and said almost nothing. Eddie Mannix's legacy remains complicated. He was linked to some of Hollywood's most infamous cover-ups. Rumors followed him about how far he would go to protect the studio's image. Some stories were substantiated, others remain contested. But the 1948 moment wasn't dramatic enough to make headlines or history books. That's why it matters. Because it shows how power truly operates. Not through spectacle. Through calibration. A joke. A silence. A dial turning. 3 phone calls. And behavior changes across a city. The unsettling truth is that no one in that room considered themselves villains. Mayer believed he was protecting an empire that employed thousands. Hopper believed she was balancing truth with influence. Mannix believed he was maintaining stability. And the actress believed she was preserving her future. Everyone justified their position. That's what makes institutional power so durable. It rarely feels cruel from the inside. It feels necessary. Imagine that office again. The blinds casting narrow shadows. The dust suspended in late afternoon light. The phrase loose mouths drifting carelessly across polished wood. And Mannix lowering his eyes. Not reacting. Just reaching for the phone. In that small movement, the hierarchy clarified itself. Words had limits. Authority did not. The real aftermath of that afternoon wasn't scandal. It was internalization. The people involved adjusted themselves so thoroughly that the system no longer needed visible enforcement. The actress avoided risky friendships. The agent tightened his circle. The brother stopped asking questions. The columnist weighed her columns more carefully. The executives joked less freely. And Mannix never had to reference the incident again. Because the memory did the work for him. That is how fear survives. Quietly. Today, when we look back at old Hollywood, we often focus on glamour or tragedy, the premieres, the affairs, the shocking deaths. But power was most effective in moments no one photographed. Behind closed doors. In offices where conversations were short. Where silence carried more meaning than argument. And where a man smiling gently could rearrange multiple lives without raising his voice. The actress never told the full story. The brother never confronted the studio. Hopper never wrote about the call. And Mannix never apologized for it. The system moved forward. Films were made. Contracts were signed. Rumors were redirected. But in kitchens across Los Angeles, there were people who remembered an evening when the phone rang and a calm voice reminded them how things worked. That memory lingered longer than any headline could have. Because it proved something unsettling. In 1948 Hollywood, power did not need to destroy you publicly. It only needed to let you know it could reach you privately. And once you understood that, you behaved. Silently.